Welcome to the arena of democracy, the history of American presidential debates. In this series, we're diving into the heart of American politics, exploring how a system that once operated behind closed doors has evolved into a public-driven democracy. We'll trace the journey from an elitist republic, where party insiders pulled the strings, to the vibrant, public arena where debates now shape the fate of campaigns. Through this evolution, we'll see how public debates became not just relevant, but one of the most decisive elements in modern campaigns. We'll uncover the role these debates play within each campaign, how they can ignite a powerful connection between a candidate and the people, or how they can unravel even the most promising political careers. As we journey through the history of debates, we'll also witness how the themes and strategies of campaigns have changed over time, reflecting the evolving priorities of the nation. So, sit back and join us as we explore the evolution of American democracy and relive the most pivotal moments in the fight for the most powerful office in the world. The President of the United States is elected every 4 years through an indirect election process, which means citizens don't elect the president directly but instead elect middlemen known as electors. These electors are part of a system called the Electoral College. This election process involves several stages, starting with primaries and caucuses, where members of each political party vote in a series of state contests to choose their party's delegates. These delegates then attend their party's national convention, where they choose their presidential candidate. In the U.S. Electoral College system, each state's number of electors is equal to the sum of its senators and representatives in Congress. The most populous states have more electors. For instance, California, the largest state, has 55 electors. Texas follows with 38 electors, and Florida and New York each have 29 electors. On the other hand, the smallest states by population, such as Wyoming, Vermont and Alaska, each have only 3 electors. This structure ensures a balance of power, giving both populous and less populous states proportional representation in the Electoral College. Aside from Maine and Nebraska, all U.S. states use the winner-takes-all system in presidential elections. Under this system, the presidential candidate who receives the majority of the popular vote in a state wins all of that state's electoral votes. For example, in California, which has 55 electoral votes, if a candidate wins the majority of the popular vote, they receive all 55 votes. This method amplifies the impact of winning populous states like California because securing a majority, even by a narrow margin, grants the candidate all the state's electoral votes, significantly contributing to the 270 electoral votes needed to win the presidency. In an extreme scenario, if the election in California were decided by just one vote, that single vote would not only decide the state winner but also swing all 55 electoral votes, a swing that accounts for almost 10% of the total electoral college. Of course, in theory, the scenario of a single vote deciding California's 55 electoral votes could happen, but in reality, it is highly improbable due to the historical voting patterns of the state. California has consistently voted for the Democratic Party in the last 8 presidential elections and is not expected to vote for the Republicans in upcoming elections. Similarly, Texas, the second most populous state, has voted for the Republicans in the last 11 elections and shows no signs of shifting its allegiance soon. This predictability introduces us to the concept of safe states, states where the winning party feels comfortable about their chances of winning due to historical voting trends. However, not all states exhibit such predictability. There are also swing states, the real battlegrounds of presidential elections. Among 50 federal states, these 10 to 12 fluctuating states, such as Florida, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, are where the outcomes of elections are genuinely uncertain, and therefore, they are the focus of intense campaign efforts by candidates. The results in these swing states are crucial, as they often determine the overall winner of the presidential race. Although working without major interruption for centuries, this system is not entirely perfect. When the power of a few thousand votes may mean nothing in some states but can change the course of the entire country in others, the system reveals some significant flaws. For instance, there have been instances of faithless electors, where some electors voted against the candidate they had pledged to support. While this has not changed the outcome of any presidential election, it did cause one vice president, Richard M. Johnson in 1836, to lose the majority, although he ultimately received the position through a Senate resolution. Another problematic issue arises when candidates who receive the most popular votes lose the election. This has occurred 5 times in U.S. history, with the most recent instance in 2016 when Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump. Despite receiving approximately 2.9 million more votes than Trump, equating to a 2.1% lead in the popular vote, she lost the Electoral College 227 to 304. This demonstrates the impact of the winner-takes-all system but also raises questions regarding the justice of the current system. Since 1788, the United States has held presidential elections, but the intense, public-driven races we see today didn't start that way. It was a gradual process. In the beginning, elections were heavily influenced by the political elite. The public's role was minimal, but with each election, their involvement grew. Take the first election in 1788, George Washington, a hero of the Revolutionary War, was unanimously chosen by all 69 electors. He secured the presidency with just 28,000 popular votes in a nation of nearly 4 million people. The turnout was only 11.6%. Less than 1% of the population actually voted for him. By 1796, things began to change. The race between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson marked the first time 2 parties competed for the presidency. Adams won, but it was the last time a president and vice president came from different parties, a quirk of the early system where the runner-up became vice president. The 1800 election was a rematch between Adams and Jefferson, but this time, campaigning took on a new life. Neither candidate wanted to appear too eager, fearing they'd be seen as demagogues, but Jefferson's running mate, Aaron Burr, took a different approach. He's often credited as the father of modern campaign techniques, focusing on the people rather than the elite. Historian Joanne B. Freeman described Burr as a leader who mobilized a league of energetic young supporters, using them to drive his campaign. This grassroots approach helped Jefferson win the election, signaling a shift. Elections were now as much a matter of the streets as they were of the salons. By 1804, the public's involvement grew, and elections became heated, with accusations flying back and forth. The climate was so heated that Vice President Burr fatally injured Federalist Party's big shot Alexander Hamilton. Blood was shed. The competition between gentlemen was turning into a street fight at full speed. The 1812 election was the last competitive race between the Democratic-Republican Party and the Federalist Party. The Federalists' anti-war stance against Britain made them seem as if they were conflicting with national interests, costing them dearly, especially after the War of 1812, leading to their rapid decline. In 1816, support for the Federalist candidate Rufus King dropped to just 13%. He would be the last candidate from the Federalist Party, and by 1820, Democratic-Republican Party's James Monroe ran unopposed. This was a pause in American democracy. But in 1824, even with a single-party system, competition returned. No candidate won a majority, so the House of Representatives chose John Quincy Adams, despite Andrew Jackson having more popular and electoral votes. This tension would soon tear the party apart. After the 1824 election, the Democratic-Republican Party split, giving rise to the National Republican Party under John Quincy Adams and the Democratic Party under Andrew Jackson, laying the foundation for today's two-party system. In 1828, Andrew Jackson won decisively, reclaiming the presidency. This election is often seen as the beginning of modern American politics, removing barriers to voter participation and establishing a stable two-party system. The environment for public debate was ripening, and the period from the 1830s to the mid-1860s saw instability on the right side of the political spectrum, with various parties competing for dominance. One of the key figures in this era, who would lead the nation through its greatest crisis and unite the right under the Republican banner, was Abraham Lincoln, the protagonist of the first real presidential debates. Most historians consider the 1858 debates between former Congressman Abraham Lincoln and Senator Stephen Douglas as the first ancestor of modern presidential debates. Interestingly, this wasn't a debate between two presidential candidates, but between two candidates vying for a Senate seat in Illinois. What makes these debates so significant, and why they are seen as the precursor to presidential debates, is that first, both men would be racing for the presidency just 2 years later. But more importantly, the debates captured national interest on an unprecedented scale. At the time of the debates, Douglas had already held his Senate seat for 11 years and was a powerful figure in Illinois. Lincoln, a lawyer and rising star in the Republican Party, was the challenger. It's still unclear what Douglas expected to gain from these debates, given his strong position, but Lincoln's tactic of speaking one day after Douglas in every town, making it appear as though Douglas was avoiding a face-to-face debate, may have pushed him to accept the challenge. The debates took place in 7 different districts across Illinois. Each debate was planned for 3 hours. One candidate would speak for 60 minutes, followed by a 90-minute response from the other, and then a 30-minute closing argument to wrap up. The main focus of the debates was the issue of slavery, specifically, whether it should be allowed in new states formed from the territories acquired through the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican Cession. Douglas, the Democratic candidate, argued that the residents of the new states should decide for themselves, a concept known as popular sovereignty. Lincoln, on the other hand, argued against the expansion of slavery. The debates occurred between August and October of 1858. Physically, more than 80,000 people attended the events, including many from neighboring states. Never before in American history had there been such intense newspaper coverage of a political event. Both candidates felt as though they were speaking to the entire nation. The new technology of the time, railroads, telegraphs, and fast note-taking systems, allowed the state's largest newspapers, especially those in Chicago, to send trained note-takers to record and report the debates in full. These reports were published sometimes within hours of the speeches. The Associated Press network sent these reports across the country, allowing newspapers from coast to coast to print them, making the debates national events. Although Lincoln lost the Senate race to Douglas, who had the advantage of incumbency, the debates made Lincoln a national figure. They paved the way for his successful bid for the presidency in 1860, where he led the United States through the Civil War, defended the Union, played a major role in abolishing slavery, expanded the power of the federal government, and modernized the U.S. economy until his assassination in 1865. After the Lincoln-Douglas debates, it would be a long time before we saw anything similar. In 1940, Republican candidate Wendell Willkie repeatedly invited President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to a face-to-face debate, but it would take another 20 years for the first televised debate between presidential candidates to finally take place. The tradition of candidates debating before the public began within party lines, where it became the norm for candidates from the same party while they were competing to be the party's candidate. But by the 1960s, it was becoming an expectation for candidates from opposing parties to engage in public debates. In the 1956 election campaign, a University of Maryland student named Fred Kahn led an effort to bring the two major presidential candidates, Adlai Stevenson II and President Dwight Eisenhower, to the campus for a debate. Despite widespread public interest, Eisenhower declined to debate. We would also see in the future that presidents who had an advantage might avoid facing an opponent. As the 1960 election approached, Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, became the Republican candidate with little opposition. On the Democratic side, after a series of internal battles, a young senator named John F. Kennedy emerged as the candidate. At the start of the campaign, polls showed Nixon leading Kennedy by 3 to 6 percentage points. The campaign centered on two main issues: the Cold War and domestic progress. Kennedy argued that the Republican administration had allowed the U.S. to fall behind the Soviet Union economically and militarily. He claimed that the U.S. had lost ground in the space race and that Soviet influence was expanding around the globe, threatening American security. His promise was to get America moving again. Nixon, on the other hand, emphasized the peace and prosperity achieved during the Republican administration and criticized Kennedy's inexperience. Kennedy's campaign turned his youthfulness into an advantage, raising doubts about Nixon's experience. Nixon, in turn, positioned himself as a key advisor to President Eisenhower. However, this backfired when a journalist asked Eisenhower if he could name any major ideas from Nixon that he had adopted. Eisenhower's reckless reply damaged Nixon's campaign. Kennedy capitalized on it, even creating a TV commercial that aired nationwide.
A reporter recently asked President Eisenhower this question about Mr. Nixon's experience.
I just wondered if you could give us an example of a major idea of his that you had adopted in that role as the decider and final.
If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember.
Because
At the same press conference, President Eisenhower said,
no one can make a decision except me.
and as for any major ideas from Mr. Nixon,
If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember.
President Eisenhower could not remember, but the voters will remember. For real leadership in the 60s, help elect Senator John F. Kennedy president.
Nixon also made a tactical error by promising to visit all 50 states. After injuring his knee, he was forced to pause his campaign for 2 weeks, leading to an exhausting and inefficient campaign schedule, spending time in states where the outcome was unlikely to change. Amidst this backdrop, the first U.S. presidential debate was held. The candidates agreed to 4 debates, with the first taking place at WBBM-TV in Chicago on September 26, 1960. This debate would prove to be decisive. The format focused on the candidates answering questions from the audience. Kennedy, having prepared for several days, appeared relaxed, confident, and fresh. Nixon, who had been campaigning until just a few hours before, looked pale, tired, and unhealthy. His refusal to wear television makeup left him with a sweaty, uncomfortable appearance. While radio listeners thought Nixon had won, the majority of TV viewers saw Kennedy as the clear victor, thanks to his confident and composed demeanor. Before the debate, polls showed an even race. However, after the first debate, they began to show a small but consistent advantage for Kennedy. This first debate was watched by 66.4 million people in the United States. Given the close outcome of the election, it's clear that this debate played a crucial role in shaping history. Although Nixon was considered more successful in the second and third debates, the impact of the first debate on the polls could not be reversed. This debate series was also a monumental step for television. The third debate, in particular, was notable for being the first time split-screen technology was used, allowing the candidates to appear as if they were in the same room despite being on opposite sides of the country, Nixon in Los Angeles and Kennedy in New York. Kennedy won the election with 49.72% of the popular vote, just slightly more than Nixon's 49.55%. The difference was only about 100,000 popular votes, but in the Electoral College, Kennedy secured 303 votes compared to Nixon's 219. This presidential debate would be the last of its kind for 16 years. The main reason for the absence of presidential debates in the next 3 elections was clear. In each case, one candidate held a significant advantage from the start of the campaign, making the risk of a debate seem unnecessary. After President Kennedy was tragically assassinated in 1963, his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, assumed the presidency. In 1964, Johnson was the Democratic candidate, and while there was no established tradition of televised debates, his strong position made a debate a potential risk. Despite multiple challenges from his opponent, Republican candidate Barry Goldwater, Johnson refused to engage in a televised debate. In the 1968 election, Richard Nixon, who had narrowly lost to Kennedy in 1960, was once again the Republican candidate. He faced Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president, as his opponent. Nixon started the campaign with a significant lead in the polls, and given his negative experience with the Kennedy debate, he declined Humphrey's challenges to debate. By the time the 1972 election arrived, President Richard Nixon had established a consistent 20 to 25% lead over his opponent, Democrat George McGovern. With such a large advantage, Nixon once again opted out of debating, avoiding the risks that a televised confrontation could bring. This period, spanning 3 elections, highlighted the strategic decision by candidates to avoid debates when holding a commanding lead. For those in such a strong position, the potential risks of a debate often far outweighed any perceived benefits. In 1974, the Watergate scandal, which began with a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex and escalated into a series of political crimes and cover-ups orchestrated by members of the Nixon administration, forced Richard Nixon to resign from the presidency, marking a dark chapter in American political history. His vice president, Gerald Ford, assumed the presidency, but unlike his predecessors, Ford had not been elected by the public as vice president. Instead, he was appointed after Nixon's first vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned due to a separate scandal. This unique situation made Ford a natural, but somewhat unusual, presidential candidate for the 1976 election. On the other side, a relatively unknown former governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, emerged as the Democratic candidate after a tough battle within his party. President Gerald Ford faced significant challenges as he campaigned for the presidency. The U.S. economy was struggling through a two-year-long recession combined with the 1973 oil crisis, leading to a rare and troubling case of stagflation. In 1975 alone, 2.3 million Americans lost their jobs, and the unemployment rate surged from under 5% to 9% in just 1 year. Adding to Ford's difficulties was his controversial decision to pardon former President Nixon, which damaged his image further. However, by the second half of 1975, the worst of the recession was behind, and the economy began to grow again. Ford sought to position himself as a statesman leader who had navigated the nation through a difficult time. Initially, Carter's lack of experience in national politics was seen as a disadvantage. However, in the post-Watergate climate of Washington, D.C., Carter's image as an outsider and clean reformer worked to his advantage. This helped him build a significant lead in the polls, with a margin of 7 to 18% just 1 month before the first debate. 3 debates were agreed upon between the candidates. The first debate was held on September 23, 1976. Midway through the 90-minute debate, a technical malfunction caused the sound to be lost for 27 minutes, pausing the debate. Despite this interruption, Ford was generally considered the winner of the first debate. He effectively highlighted Carter's inexperience as a national leader, and his vague stance on some critical issues played in Ford's favor. After the first debate, Gallup polls showed Carter's lead shrinking to just 2%, down from an 11% difference before the debate. However, the second debate would prove to be a turning point, marked by one of the biggest gaffes in debate history. The debate, focused on international politics, was initially expected to be Ford's opportunity to outshine his opponent. But when asked about the Soviet Union's influence in Eastern Europe, Ford made a blunder that would change the course of the election.
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
His statement caused even shock on the panelists. The journalist gave him a chance to clarify, asking if he was suggesting that the Soviets were not using Eastern Europe as their sphere of influence. Ford doubled down, responding, "I don't believe that the Poles consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union." This insistence made Ford appear out of touch with the realities of the Cold War, particularly to voters from Eastern European backgrounds. This gaffe broke Ford's momentum, and Gallup polls showed Carter's lead growing back to 6%. The third debate, held just weeks before the election, was far less impactful, offering no major advantage to either candidate. On November 2, 1976, Jimmy Carter won the election with 50.1% of the popular vote compared to Ford's 48%. In the Electoral College, Carter secured 297 votes against Ford's 240. The margin was narrow. Had just 6,000 votes in Ohio or 18,000 votes in Wisconsin shifted to Ford, he would have won the electoral majority. It's a striking reminder of how one moment in a debate can alter the course of history. Without that blunder, the 1980s might have looked very different, and perhaps the world would not have known Ronald Reagan as the president who delivered some of the most memorable performances in the debate arena. As the 1980s began, a new figure took center stage in American politics, Ronald Reagan. Unlike any politician before him, Reagan's career as a sportscaster and Hollywood film star had shaped his ability to connect with and influence people. For Reagan, engaging the public wasn't just a campaign skill, it was his life. Reagan's rise as a leading conservative figure was driven by his unmatched ability to captivate and inspire audiences. His speech, A Time for Choosing, delivered in support of Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater at the 1964 Republican Convention, immediately elevated him to a prominent position within the conservative wing of the Republican Party. This speech remains one of the most influential in American political history. Just 2 years later, the Hollywood star became the Republican governor of California in 1966. His ambition didn't stop there. In 1976, Reagan challenged incumbent President Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination. Although Reagan won more votes overall, he lost the nomination due to a smaller number of delegates. However, this effort made him the clear favorite to be the Republican candidate in 1980. In the 1980 primaries, Reagan easily secured the Republican nomination, receiving more than twice the votes of his closest rival, former CIA Director George H.W. Bush. Reagan solidified his campaign by choosing Bush as his running mate. Meanwhile, President Jimmy Carter faced a difficult presidential term. Though he initially appeared to have overcome the slow growth and inflation problems of the Ford administration, the 1979 oil crisis caused oil prices to double in a short time, leading to inflation soaring from 5% to 18% and unemployment rising from 5% to 8%. All of Carter's economic achievements seemed to unravel in a matter of months. Coupled with his poor handling of the Iran hostage crisis, which began in late 1979, Carter's approval ratings plummeted. Unexpectedly for a sitting president, Carter had to fight hard to secure his party's nomination for a second term. Reagan, on the other hand, focused his campaign on addressing the economic instability that had plagued the country since 1973. He promised to lower taxes by 30% and balance the budget within 3 years while criticizing Carter's weak crisis management and vowing to restore America's military strength, which he argued had diminished during the 1970s. Carter, in contrast, tried to portray Reagan as an old, uncompromising, and unpredictable warmonger, a threat to civil rights and social programs. As September approached, polls showed Reagan with a 4% lead over Carter. Independent candidate John Anderson, who had around 15% support in the polls, qualified to participate in the presidential debates by meeting the 15% threshold set by the organizers. However, when the debates were being organized, President Carter insisted that Anderson not be allowed to participate, demanding a one-on-one debate with Reagan. Reagan saw an opportunity and refused to debate unless Anderson was included. Reagan remarked, "Carter knows that he couldn't win a debate even if it were held in the White House before his White House staff and with the questions asked by his press advisor." The first debate was held on September 21, 1980, without President Carter. Reagan cleverly turned the event into a critique of Carter's presidency. The debate opened with a striking exchange. Anderson stated, "Governor Reagan is not responsible for what has happened over the last 4 years, nor am I. The man who should be here tonight to respond to those charges chose not to attend," to which Reagan added, "It's a shame now that there are only 2 of us here debating because the 2 that are here are in more agreement than disagreement." After this debate, the public saw little difference between Anderson and Reagan, leading Anderson's support to drop below 10%, costing him an invitation to the second debate. With Anderson out of the picture, a Carter-Reagan debate was set. The only debate between Carter and Reagan was scheduled for October 28, just 1 week before the election. By then, the polls showed a slim advantage for Reagan, making this debate potentially decisive. The showdown attracted one of the largest television audiences of the decade, with Nielsen Media Research reporting 80.6 million viewers. It was the most watched debate in American history until the first presidential debate of 2016. Reagan was in complete control during the debate. His background as an actor gave him a unique relationship with the camera, and his calm, confident, and reassuring demeanor helped him project himself as a capable leader ready to tackle the nation's challenges. Carter, on the other hand, appeared more detailed, aggressive, and nervous. While Reagan clearly articulated his vision for economic growth, a strong national defense, and reducing the role of government, Carter spent much of the debate on the defensive, responding to questions about his administration's failures and launching attacks on Reagan's character. One of the most memorable moments of the debate came when Carter attacked Reagan's opposition to a national health care system.
Is against such a proposal.
Governor, there you go again.
Reagan's calm and relaxed response, "There you go again," became an iconic moment in presidential debate history. But the knockout blow came when Reagan addressed the American people directly in the closing part of the debate.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things?
He said, and continued by saying, "Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago? Is America as respected throughout the world as it was? Do you feel that our security is as safe, that we're as strong as we were 4 years ago? And if you answer all of those questions yes, why then, I think your choice is very obvious as to who you'll vote for. If you don't agree, if you don't think that this course that we've been on for the last 4 years is what you would like to see us follow for the next 4, then I could suggest another choice that you have." Voters responded to Reagan's message by giving him 50.7% of the vote, compared to Carter's 41%. Reagan won 489 of 538 electoral votes, defeating Carter in 44 out of 50 states. The Reagan era began with overwhelming support, marking a significant shift in American politics. When Ronald Reagan took office in January 1981, the United States was facing severe economic challenges. The nation was struggling with high inflation, rising unemployment, and stagnant growth, a troubling combination known as stagflation. Reagan introduced his economic policies, known as Reaganomics, aiming to stimulate the economy through significant tax cuts, deregulation, and reduced government spending. However, the initial impact was harsh. The first 2 years of Reagan's administration were marked by a deep recession. Unemployment surged from 7% to 11%, and the poverty rate climbed from 12% to 15%. The only positive outcome was a substantial decrease in inflation, which fell from the mid-teens to the mid-single digits. Reagan's early presidency was fraught with difficulties. His approval ratings dipped to as low as 35%, and the Republican Party faced setbacks in the 1982 midterm elections, losing 26 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives and 7 governorships. These challenges made Reagan's first 2 years in office particularly daunting, casting doubts on his ability to deliver on his promises. However, by the latter half of Reagan's first term, signs of recovery began to emerge. Inflation had been largely controlled, and following the 1982 recession, the economy began to rebound strongly. In 1983, economic growth accelerated to 6.4%, followed by an impressive 7.2% in 1984. Unemployment decreased back to 7%, and the poverty rate stabilized at 15%. As the nation witnessed this economic turnaround, Reagan's approval ratings began to rise, reflecting renewed confidence among the American public. Beyond economic recovery, Reagan focused on restoring the United States' defense capabilities and national confidence, which had been undermined by events such as the Iran hostage crisis. The Beirut barracks bombings and the U.S. invasion of Grenada were pivotal moments that reinforced Reagan's commitment to a strong national defense and demonstrated his administration's ability to respond decisively to international crises. These actions helped to restore a sense of national pride and confidence, bolstering Reagan's support base. By the time of the 1984 election, Reagan's approval ratings had climbed to 52%, even surpassing his initial election performance. The Democratic Party nominated Walter Mondale, vice president under Jimmy Carter, as their presidential candidate. Mondale's running mate, Geraldine Ferraro, made history as the first female vice presidential candidate for a major U.S. party. Mondale built his campaign on themes of economic fairness, social justice, and advocating for women's rights. He criticized Reagan's administration for its growing budget deficits and insufficient support for social programs. Despite Mondale's clear and well-articulated messages, he faced an uphill battle against Reagan's strong voter base. Reagan's personal charisma and the narrative of economic recovery and renewed national pride proved to be formidable advantages. Leading up to the debates, polls indicated that Reagan maintained a 10 to 15% advantage over Mondale. The first debate between Reagan and Mondale took place on October 7, 1984. Contrary to expectations, Mondale was seen as the clear winner of the debate. His articulate communication and incisive attacks on Reagan's economic policies, which he argued favored only the wealthy, gave Reagan a tough time. Additionally, Reagan, at 73, appeared visibly tired and struggled to respond to complex questions about issues like Social Security, raising concerns about his age and ability to serve another term. At one part of the debate, when Reagan tried to attract the audience with his favorite move,
There you go again. I don't have a plan to tax or increase taxes. I'm not going to increase.
Mondale handled Reagan's "there you go again" and turn it into his advantage was a good summary of the whole debate.
You said, "Oh no, there you go again, Mr. President." And what did you do right after the election? You went out and tried to cut $20 billion out of Medicare. And
this performance shifted the campaign's focus to Reagan's age and fitness, narrowing his lead to 7% in the polls. 2 weeks later, the second and final debate approached, with Mondale riding the momentum of his strong first debate performance. This debate was critical, as any further dominance by Mondale could have significantly altered the election outcome. One of the most pressing questions came from a journalist about Reagan's age and capability to handle national crises. "Mr. President, you are the oldest person ever elected to the presidency. Is there any doubt in your mind that you can handle the demands of the office, especially in times of crisis?"
I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
The audience reacted with laughter and applause to Reagan's confident answer. Mondale later admitted that Reagan's answer had effectively neutralized the age criticism, saying, "If TV can tell the truth, as you say it can, you will see that I was smiling, but I think if you came in close, you'd see some tears coming down because I knew he had gotten me there. After this debate, I walked off and was almost certain the campaign was over, and it was." In the November 6, 1984, election, Ronald Reagan won re-election in a landslide victory, securing 525 of the 538 electoral votes and winning 49 states with 58.8% of the popular vote. Walter Mondale received only 13 electoral votes, winning his home state of Minnesota and the District of Columbia. Reagan's victory marked the second largest electoral college margin since 1820, the largest ever for a Republican candidate, and the most electoral votes received by a candidate. It also remains the last time a candidate won the popular vote by a double-digit margin, solidifying Reagan's legacy and ushering in the Reagan era with overwhelming support. Ronald Reagan's second term was widely seen as a success. By 1985, Reaganomics had begun to bear fruit, inflation had dropped to 3.5%, and unemployment had fallen to 5%. On the global stage, the US gained a psychological edge over the Soviet Union. At Gorbachev's request, Reagan even gave a speech on free markets at Moscow State University, symbolizing this shift. Although crises like the Iran-Contra affair briefly hurt Reagan's image, their impact was short-lived. Reagan's approval ratings rebounded from 50% to 63% in his final year, leaving him with a strong legacy. Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush, Reagan's loyal second-in-command, was seen as the natural successor. He secured the Republican nomination with relative ease, outmaneuvering limited opposition. On the Democratic side, the party struggled to find a candidate who could redefine its image. Having won only one of the last 5 presidential elections since Lyndon Johnson's victory in 1964, the Democrats were eager for a leader who could guide them into the 1990s. However, the Republican Party's strong position made this a daunting task, and several potential candidates either dropped out or declined to run. Eventually, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis emerged as the Democratic nominee. A 55-year-old Harvard-educated lawyer and liberal, Dukakis was precisely the kind of opponent Vice President Bush hoped to face. Wasting no time, Bush launched his campaign with promises to continue Reagan's successful policies, extending Reaganomics, fighting crime and drugs, maintaining a strong national defense, and taking a firm stance against communism. The most memorable moment of his campaign was his bold declaration, "Read my lips, no new taxes."
Read my lips, no new taxes.
Bush also capitalized on his tough conservative image, inherited from Reagan, and painted Dukakis as an out-of-touch, Massachusetts liberal, part of an elite, narrow society disconnected from everyday Americans. He portrayed Dukakis as soft on crime, citing records from his time as governor. Dukakis struggled to counter these attacks. The tough conservative image was more appealing than the elite liberal persona in the late 1980s. Rumors, such as one about Dukakis's wife allegedly burning a US flag to protest the Vietnam War, and a widely mocked photo of him on top of a tank, further damaged his campaign. Whatever Dukakis did seemed to backfire. As the first debate approached, Bush led by 4 to 6 points in various polls. The debate, held on September 22, 1988, saw no clear winner. Although Dukakis performed better than expected by directly addressing voters instead of being framed by Bush's campaign, he failed to make significant gains. Bush remained consistent with his campaign messages, and polls after the debate still showed him leading by 5 points. The turning point came during the second debate on October 13. Dukakis, weakened by the flu, had spent much of the day in bed. The debate began with a question from moderator Bernard Shaw about Dukakis's wife, a moment that would seal his fate.
If Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
Dukakis's response lacked the emotional resonance many expected when faced with such a personal and tragic scenario.
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life.
His answer, devoid of passion, severely damaged his campaign, leading people to perceive him as emotionally detached or simply saying what was expected to win the election. Bush didn't perform particularly well in the debate, but he didn't need to. Dukakis had already lost the moment he answered that question. After the debate, 2 NBC News, Wall Street Journal polls showed Bush with a commanding lead, ahead by 17 and 19 points. In the November 8 election, Bush won decisively, with nearly 8% more of the popular vote than Dukakis, 53.4% to 45.6%. Bush also secured 426 electoral votes, winning 40 states. Dukakis, meanwhile, carried only 10 states and the District of Columbia. Despite this overwhelming defeat, Dukakis remained governor of Massachusetts until 1991, becoming the longest-serving governor in the state's history. While Bush's victory was significant, the 1988 campaign is also remembered for its negative tone and reliance on personal attacks and fear-based messaging. This approach set a new benchmark for future campaigns, particularly those of right-wing populist leaders, and left a lasting impact on American political strategy. As we wrap up with the 1988 elections and the end of the Reagan era, we've reached the conclusion of part 1 of our documentary. In the second part of our documentary, we'll take you through the evolution of modern debates after the 1990s, exploring how these moments have shaped campaigns and influenced voters in ways that continue to resonate today. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to dive deeper into similar topics, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you engaging, well-researched documentaries on history and beyond. Stay tuned for more fascinating insights into the world of politics, culture, and other intriguing subjects. We're dedicated to providing even better content for curious minds like yours.